And at least since 2005, we have seen that the Violence Against Women Act have really enhanced safety, has increased access to resources and programming for Alaska Native and American Indian tribes to combat domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, trafficking, all of the gender-based violence crimes that we're all very familiar with at our local tribal level. Something else I wanted to talk about briefly, and I'm sure that I want to talk about it briefly. I could spend a whole hour talking about full faith and credit of tribal DVPOs, but I wanted to mention that the first iteration, so the 1994 iteration, or maybe maybe it was a little bit later, but the first iteration of VAWA had this section 2265, and that is overall, it requires that all governments, so the state of Alaska government, the state of Washington government, the Kotlik tribal government, the ONC tribal government, it requires them to give what's called full faith and credit to all tribal domestic violence protective orders. Full faith and credit recognition and enforcement is just a fancy legal term. And it essentially means that you will recognize this order as valid and enforce it as your own. And so there's this requirement in federal law. It's 18 USC 2265. It stems from the first iteration of the Violence Against Women Act. And it requires that any valid and unexpired domestic violence protective order, whether that comes from the state of Alaska, where that comes from an Alaska Native tribe, where that comes from downstate tribe. But if it's valid and unexpired on its face, then every jurisdiction in the United States is required to enforce it as if it were issued by your own jurisdiction. So what that means in Alaska, it means that if a tribal court issued a domestic violence protective order that was VAWA compliant, then that means that the state of Alaska court systems, the state of Alaska Department of Public Safety, the state of Alaska law enforcement officers, everyone is required to enforce it, that tribal domestic violence protective order, as if it were issued by the state of Alaska. I know that this process and this has been challenging. It's been challenging not only in the sense that we have state law enforcement officers, we have state officials, we have state congresspeople that don't necessarily understand full faith and credit. They don't understand the federal obligations, and they don't understand the limitations of what their review can take. And so we have been doing a lot of work over the last 5 years, specifically on educating the state on what their responsibilities are, on having this conversation with law enforcement officers so they understand, on making sure that the correct information is given to our tribes so that we can lead with the right information, so we can lead with accurate information, so we can start educating some of the rhetoric, some of the bad understanding, some of the bad language and practices that we experience from our state government. All that to say that this is a federal law. It is required of states, it's required of municipalities, it's required of tribes. And so this is the 2265 on the screen is the location of that. There were problems in Alaska leading up to 2017, but I wanted to share this as well. This is from, it's a memorandum of law, or a memorandum from the Alaska Department of Law from Rob Henderson, who is still in our criminal division, but it was a memorandum on the enforcement of tribal court protective orders. Again, there were problems in Alaska where state law enforcement officers, so our troopers are, sorry guys, I told you that they were gonna have reindeer in here at 2 o'clock, and apparently the reindeer and some weird looking Santa are in here right now. But so this came from our Department of Law. It required that it was a clarification memo. It was sent out to all law enforcement officers, and it says, hey, state law enforcement officers, there's this federal law. You're required to enforce tribal protective orders. And here are the elements, or here is what we're going to look at to determine if the Department of Public Safety is able to enforce it. And so you see there in the middle, and I apologize, it's so small. I'm happy to send this to Denise and to Roxanne if needed, but you'll see in the middle there that the tribal order must identify the petitioner and the respondent. So we need to make sure that our tribal court orders have the name of the petitioner, the name of the respondent. It must include provisions that intend to prevent violent or threatening acts, harassment, sexual violence, contact, communication, proximity to person, or stalking. And you see these are what we're all familiar with. These are those protections in a domestic violence protective orders, like, if I was a respondent, it would say something like, Rick Garcia, you're required to stay 500 feet away from Denise Nerby at all times. You're not allowed to have any communication with her except by text message. You can't be near her work, which is located at this address. And that's what that second bullet point means. And then finally, it must be authentic. And there's no rhyme or reason to what authentic looks like, but it certainly needs to be signed by a tribal court judge or multiple judges if that's the system you use. And it also needs to be dated. But some recommendations on tribal domestic violence protective orders: when we have a tribe that is having challenges getting a tribal DVPO enforced by state law enforcement officers, we always attach this memorandum to the back when we hand that packet to tribal or to state law enforcement. Okay, so lots about the first VAWA iteration. We're kind of breeze through the second and third ones. But 2005 VAWA, like I said, that was the second reiteration or reauthorization of it. It was really a historic, this is one of those historic amendments that really did a lot for Indian country and Alaska Native villages. It created a separate, yes.
I'm sorry, before you get too much further, I wanted to address one of the questions in the chat box. Many city municipality codes need to be updated badly, just like my village has unorganized ordinances and codes from the 90s. What are the differences between a city municipality and tribes?
Yeah, Francis, thank you for that question. It's a really great question. Functionally, so how they function is not going to be too terribly different, right? So a municipality government and the tribal government all are formed to take care of their citizens. And it gets really confusing in Alaska because, tribal citizens will be a member and subject to the tribal jurisdiction. If they live in the municipality, they're going to be subject to the city too. The main differences I think that people are going to see, they're all going to have their government somewhat set up the same. They're all going to have the same core governmental functions of providing services to their people, providing protection for the land. In tribal governments, you'll see the culture, the history, and its citizens and its members. In a city government, a municipality, you're likely to see a lot of Western influence laws. And that's going to be, I think we're all pretty familiar with code books that are hundreds of pages long that, are very difficult to read. On the opposite side, you may see older codes from the 30s or from the early 70s. If we're to compare laws where a tribe kind of looks like a municipality, and I think those are becoming more few and far in between. I think tribes are looking at revising their codes from the 90s, from the 70s, from the 30s. And back then, to be quite honest, a lot of the codes that were circulated throughout Alaska were very cookie cutter. So they were done probably by somebody who worked for the state or federal government and kind of circulated amongst tribe. But for instance, again, to answer your question, at the very basic level, both governments are going to have the same types of core functions, which is to protect, provide services, and to ensure the stability and sustainability of their governments. But how they do those similar government-related functions is going to be different because tribal governments are generally more holistic and non-punitive, whereas city governments are oftentimes, especially Western governments, are oftentimes punitive. Francis, does that answer your question? I hope so. Oh yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, so the 2005 VAWA, again, this was historic because from 1994 to 2005, lots of tribal leaders were standing up saying, hey, this is great, federal government, Violence Against Women Act. We need for you to recognize that there is a difference between violence against non-Native women and violence against Native women. And so there was a separate subtitle in the 2005 VAWA that was dedicated to exploring violence against Alaska Native American Indian women and creating programs and creating funding streams to support that. 2005 VAWA, of course, it re-recognized or it reaffirmed that unique legal relationship the United States has to Indian tribes and for the safety of our Alaska Native American Indian women. But again, 2005 was really historic because it kind of laid the groundwork for what is happening in 2013 and what is happening in 2022. So you remember we talked a lot about Oliphant. Remember that was that non-Native offender on the Suquamish tribe in Washington who was speeding and reckless driving that got prosecuted and then was claiming that Indian tribes did not have the jurisdiction or the right to prosecute non-Native offenders. So what happened in 2013 is Congress developed in that reauthorization this special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction pilot project. Essentially, because of Oliphant, because tribes were not able to exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-Native offenders, and you compound that with the fact that our states and our federal governments were not prosecuting non-Native offenders, there's a period of almost 30 or more than 30 years where the non-Native offenders were essentially committing crimes, having no kind of accountability or repercussions for that, committing more crimes. So what happened in 2013 is that Congress, in the VAWA reauthorization, they allowed for tribes to apply and be approved by the Department of Justice to be able to prosecute non-Native offenders who commit certain domestic violence crimes in reservation-based lands. That project was known as the pilot project. It was known as the Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction. Some things about 2013, it was really limited in scope. So they limited it to domestic violence, they limited it to dating violence, they limited it to violations of protection order with certain other requirements. And in 2013, those definitions, domestic violence, dating violence, and violations of protection order, those were defined by federal law. And so what we found, the Department of Justice rolled this out in 2013. From 2013 till 2022, there are a lot of great examples of tribes who were able to implement this pilot project, who were able to exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction, and were really able to provide that avenue, that venue for justice for their tribal survivors of gender-based violence by prosecuting non-natives in their own forums. Again, in 2013 until 2022, there were only 3 categories of crimes that could be prosecuted against a non-native. And again, those were as they were defined by federal law. And so what were the lessons learned from 2013? Some of the lessons learned, of course, were that there are lots of other issues that arise when someone has been victimized or someone is a survivor of gender-based violence. So the lessons learned from 2013 were that those 3 crimes, the dating violence, domestic violence, and violence of a protection order, it's a really limitation of the scope of what occurs when someone is victimized, when someone is forced to be a survivor of gender-based violence. For instance, there are issues with tribal justice personnel, obstruction of justice, of child abuse or child endangerment, elder abuse, financial crimes. I mean, there's a lot of different nuances to domestic violence and the victimization that occurs that is not able to be fit into a dating violence, domestic violence, or violence of protection order box created by the federal government. There were also some lessons learned from 2013. So in 2013, defendant, so the person that is being accused of committing the crime, there was this requirement that they have close ties to Indian country. And what that was parsed out through case law to determine what it meant was that non-native offender either had to live in the Indian country of the tribe, had to be employed, or had to be a spouse, intimate partner, or dating partner of a tribal member or non-member Indian who resides in the Indian country of the tribe. So just that last one, we can see, right? We can see there's going to be some problems, right? A spouse, meaning you have to be married, intimate partner, meaning you have to have some type of sexual relationship, or dating partner, meaning that you have to have some type of romantic relationship with somebody, that non-native offender. And so those were the lessons that were learned, and those were the lessons that kind of guided us into the 2022 reauthorization. But how was Alaska, or how were our Alaska Native tribes specifically left out of the 2013 reauthorization? And we already talked about this, but it was because the federal government was using this federally defined definition of quote unquote Indian country. And so the federal definition of Indian country, we find that in federal law. And again, in Alaska, it only applies to the Metlakatla Indian Reservation in Southeast because they have a reservation-based lands. And it also will apply to these individual allotments that we see scattered throughout Alaska. But the problem is because of the way that the land claims were designed and distributed by ANCSA, that because VAWA 2013 used Indian country, it left out essentially 228 of our 229 federally recognized tribes. And so that leads us to 2022 VAWA, and I promise I only have a few more slides before we have time for Q&A. But again, I wanted to kind of talk about the overview of VAWA 2022, and then next week we'll really get into diving into the criminal jurisdiction portion and Alaska pilot project. But in VAWA 2022, again, just some basics. It passed the House and Senate on March 10th of last year. So March 10th, 2022 is when it finally finished going through the House and Senate. Amazingly, it was signed by President Biden 5 days later. So that is a really quick turnaround. It was signed by President Biden on March 15th. The effective date of the act was October 1st of last year. So you'll see that October 1st is 2022 is the effective date for VAWA 2022. When we talk about the Alaska pilot project, that is the effective date of the pilot project. And it included subtitle B, which is the Alaska Tribal Public Safety Empowerment subsection, which was really, really important. And again, it's incredible that Alaska was able to have our own subsection, but it is just a continued recognition from Congress, from our congressional, from our lawmakers, that Alaska is different, that we are special, we are unique. There are many different challenges that we'd experience and we have to manage here in Alaska that a lot of our lower 48 brothers and sisters don't have to. So it's hugely historic to have a separate subtitle that is really directed at Alaska, our tribes, and especially at the violence that is committed and experienced by our Alaska Native women and children. For those that don't know, each time Congress passes a law such as this, there are always what are called congressional findings. And so it's always formatted in a way where we're going to have the problem that Congress is hoping to address by the law. And a lot of times those include reports, they include statistics, they include a lot of information. So this slide would be one of the slides that I always encourage our tribes to use when they're applying for grants. It doesn't necessarily have to be victim services grants. I mean, these information can be used to, substantiate or to as a basis for justice funding. And again, when I'm talking to our Alaska tribes, it seems kind of silly to talk about these with y'all because I know that each of you are living this every day, that we've all lived this. We all know what is happening. We all experience this, but the important part of what Congress found and what they put into this federal law was that Alaska Native women, so these are specific statistics about Alaska Native women, that they are overrepresented in the domestic violence victim population by 250% within Alaska. Although Alaska Natives comprise only 19% of the population, they represent 47% of the reported rape victims in the state. And that is, it's discouraging. Again, it's statistics I think that we all live and know. But when we think about the fact that Alaska Natives in the state, 1 out of every 5 will be Alaska Native, but that 1 out of every 2 rape victims reported are Alaska Native, those are staggering statistics. Those are things that we need to do better on. Those are things that we're really, as hard as to hear, we're grateful that it's in federal law, which is why we can cite to it now, which is why we can use them in all different types of presentations and reports. The last statistic on your screen is interesting to me too. So what Congress found and what the Tribal Indian Law and Order Commission found was that Alaska Native women, when we compare Alaska Native women compared to the populations of other Indian tribes women, so downstage tribes, Alaska Native tribal women suffer the highest rates of domestic and sexual violence in the country. Here's some more statistics about disproportionality of victimization. And we know this, these are statistics that we've seen. 80% of Alaska Native American Indian women will experience violence in their lifetime. So almost 4 in 5 Alaska Native women are going to have some type of violent experience in their lifetimes. Again, 55.6% of Alaska sexual assault victims are Alaska Native American Indian. Alaska Native American Indian people are twice as likely to be victims of homicide. And when we talk about our youth, youth are over 2 times more likely to experience physical dating violence in high school compared to their white peers. And so the purposes of Subtitle B of VAWA, the purposes of the Alaska Public Safety Empowerment subsection, they really are first and foremost to increase coordination and communication among all of the stakeholders who are charged with protecting Alaska Native women and children. So that's going to be our federal, state, our tribal, our local law enforcement agencies. And really the second one, to empower Indian tribes to effectively respond to cases of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, sex trafficking, sexual violence, and MMIP through the exercise of special tribal privilege jurisdiction. What does VAWA 22 also do? I know there's been a lot of focus on this pilot project. Of course, that's really important because we know that a lot of the domestic violence that's happening or occurring in Alaska against our Alaska Native women and children are not necessarily at the hands of Alaska Natives. They're at the hands of our non-member community that are offending and getting away with all of these horrific incidences against our Alaska Native women and children. But in addition to the pilot project, so in addition to what we're going to talk about next week, a very important subsection, which is section 1305, it clarifies and it reaffirms that Alaska tribal governments today may prosecute their tribal citizens and other Alaska Native and American Indians in both civil and criminal matters. So again, civil is where there's no threat of being imprisoned in jail. But if you remember, criminal means that either jail time is available or there's a possibility of jail time. And this was really important because, again, since statehood, there's been this misconception, there's been this misinformation, there's been this rhetoric from our state government that the only government that is authorized to prosecute criminally violations of criminal law in Alaska is the state of Alaska government. And so what Congress is saying in 1305 is that is not true, that Alaska tribes and their tribal governments are able to exercise criminal jurisdiction over their own citizens and citizens of other federally recognized tribes. This is the part we're going to spend a lot of time next week on. It creates a limited criminal jurisdiction pilot project that was modeled after the successful pilot project in VAWA 2013. And we've talked about that. That is just the ability for tribes to exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-native offenders who commit certain gender-based violent crimes in our Alaska Native villages. That is now available to Alaska tribes. There is a process that tribes need to go through to be reviewed by the Department of Justice, to be approved by the Attorney General of the United States before that can occur. But again, 2022 opened that up to Alaska Native tribes, and we're no longer bound by this definition of federal Indian country, which again, we've explained to mean in Alaska only reservations and individual allotments. But the third thing it did, it created this new jurisdiction territory definition for Alaska. So instead of using Indian country, what VAWA 2022 did, it refers to these village-based jurisdictional areas based on the Alaska Native Village Statistical Area, which is based off the census. So all that to say is that, yes, we may not still have federally defined Indian country in Alaska, but Congress has given us our own jurisdiction-based boundaries that is based on our village. And so this is based on essentially what people will do is they'll go to the Census Bureau, they'll look up their village, and you'll see a shaded area for where tribes can exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-native offenders. And again, we'll talk more about that next week, but the 2022 authorization, reauthorization did create this special language with Alaska, which was necessary because of all the problems that we've experienced and challenges that we've experienced with federally defined Indian country. Okay, that is all I have today. I'm going to turn my camera on, stop presenting, and see if there are any questions.
So just a reminder that if you're joined by the phone, to press *6 to have to unmute yourself if you have any questions, or the little microphone button at the top right-hand side of your screen.
Yes, Your Honor, I do have a comment. Mr. Garcia?
Yes, Daisy May.
I thank you for this wonderful, right to the point process of explaining. And I'd like to mention, because of who I am and what I am as a tribal judge, I come from the territory of the time where in my village, we truly exercised what you're talking about, utilizing our tribal sovereign powers through our treaty. And it took years for this to change up to this point where, unfortunately, we're having to go through this type of a process in order to be able to reattain our jurisdiction away from the state and be able to establish and develop memorandum of agreements or memorandum of understanding with the state. I'm really excited about this. Therefore, I would like to pose a question.
Yes.
How many in the state of Alaska currently has submitted an infrastructure plan? And how many in the state of Alaska currently are being considered as a pilot project? And is there any existing in our region? Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy May. Yeah, that's a great question. So there are two tribes. There were two tribes that applied. OVW had a special solicitation last summer for Alaska tribes to get resources to support criminal jurisdiction over non-natives. Two tribes applied. So that is the Chickaloon Village Tribe Traditional Council based out of Sutton, and Dot Lake Tribe based in the interior. They were both awarded funding to support the building of their infrastructure to get ready to exercise this criminal jurisdiction over non-natives. But neither one are fully ready yet. But Daisy May, those are the two tribes that are working right now towards moving towards being ready. Um, and then I want to say that, and thank you, Daisy May, because you reminded me, part of next week's presentation is going to be, the last part of it is going to be talking about funding. I think it's really important. I think that OVW and DOJ this year kind of missed the mark. There was a lot of confusing information for Alaska tribes on those two grant opportunities. But what I want to share with everyone here is that even if your tribe is thinking, let's say 10 years down the road, you think, hey, there may be a possibility that we want to punish non-native offenders for what they're doing on our lands, I would urge all of you to apply for the OVW grants. And the reason why I say that is because the funding is designed to either tribes can use it to get their tribal justice systems ready. Even if you decide you don't want to prosecute anybody criminally, there is money available for tribes to look at their systems, to have those kind of asset mapping and strategic planning sessions. And this is money specific for Alaska. And so what we'll do, or what I'll do, is when those resources come out, I'll share them with Roxanne and Denise. But I would urge everyone to apply, because there's money available to Alaska that can support a lot of the work that each of you are doing in your communities right now.
So I also want to, oh, I hear somebody. Go ahead.
Hello, this is Julia.
Hi, Julia. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you define what non-native are? Because I'm very worried about our young generations. And the young generation right now seems like they're being exploited by non-native. And some of these non-natives are from a different country. And also, I'd like to know how to maybe implement or write something to describe the kind of crimes that these non-natives come to the village, even to Bethel, to do sex trafficking or selling drugs to vulnerable young people, even to kidnap them and send them out to a different country. I wonder if there's some kind of wording or something to protect our young people from being exploited like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. It's good to hear from you. To answer your question, yeah, non-native has a specific definition, and it would be essentially someone who is not an enrolled tribal citizen of a federally recognized tribe, or someone that is not eligible for membership. That would be the definition. So that would cover that out of country, like a foreigner type of situation you were talking about. And then the second part of the question, Julia, yeah, the tribal council, if a tribe wants to exercise this jurisdiction over non-natives, there are certain crimes that the federal government has limited it to at this time. So right now, it's going to be those domestic violence crimes, those dating violence crimes, sexual assault crimes, child violence crimes, and then some obstruction of justice. But right now, those are the only crimes that a tribe can prosecute against a non-Indian in Alaska. It may expand further in the future, but right now, those are the crimes that the federal government is saying, hey, Alaska tribes, I know that Oliphant said you couldn't, but we're saying you can, but only for these crimes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And next week, I'm going to go over the specific crimes under VAWA. And we'll talk more about that. But yeah, great questions from both Julia and Daisy May.
So I wanted to just give a little bit more time, just in case anybody had any more questions for Rick. I was taught to wait for 10 seconds to pause for questions on virtual. So if it gets a little long, that's why. If there are no further questions, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. Next week, I will send out reminder emails to the addresses you registered with beginning on Monday, just as I did this week. And with that, I'm going to stop recording and thank everybody for your time today. I hope you have a great weekend and everybody